Hello and welcome to week 13. For those of you that completed your extra credit from last week, your grade should be updated by the time that you open this video, and it will be reflected on your exam 3 grade. For anyone that has missed an assignment or missed a quiz or missed an exam, you can still make up some of those points. You will not be eligible for all of those points, but definitely some. So if you are interested in receiving those points, please send me an email as soon as possible so that we can get you something for those grades. So for this week, after talking about meats last week, we are moving on to poultry and seafood. Poultry and seafood are both very similar to meat, and we will even use the word meat when we are talking about the flesh of poultry and of seafood, but this is a word that has different meanings. So we'll talk about the definitions of each of these foods. We'll compare them with meat early on in this video. But when talking about each, poultry are birds, and the term seafood includes fish with fins, and then seafood with shells on their outer layer. The key points for you to know are outlined on this slide. Early on in this chapter, there's going to be a list of key terms that you should know to really get a grasp on what we're going over in this chapter. So know the basic definitions of each of these key terms, and then when discussing poultry and types of seafood, recognize what makes them different from the foods that we classified in the last chapter as meats. We will go over different cooking techniques, and we will do so in a little bit greater depth than we did in the last few chapters. There are specific reasons for each of the cooking techniques that we go over. Know which is most ideal for fish and which is most ideal for different cuts of poultry. There will be 2 cuts of poultry. Know these. We'll highlight these later on. Know which cooking methods, very general cooking methods, are best for each. Then be able to identify the nutritional value for poultry and fish. Their value will be very similar to meats, but there are a few nutrients found in higher quantities in each of these foods. Keep an eye on the differences and also note the similarities between meat, poultry, and fish. And finally, just like meats, poultry and fish are highly susceptible to microorganism contamination, so be able to recognize what can be done to keep these foods safe in the kitchen. In this chapter, we're going to start off with the key terms. We're going to define poultry and then different types of fish, providing examples of each. We're going to talk about the specific terms for each of these classifications, and knowing these terms is critical because we need to understand what we are working with in this chapter. Poultry includes more than just chicken, and there are more fish than fish that have fins. Next, we'll go over cooking considerations for poultry and different types of fish. So we will revisit the link between tenderness and connective tissue, discuss the amount of connective tissue and tenderness of fish and poultry. We'll talk about picking out fresh fish and poultry, and then talk about whether moist heat or dry heat cooking is best for different types of fish and poultry. And then we will finish with nutritional value of chicken and fish, and then talk about the food safety risk and some food safety practices that we can use when we are working with poultry and fish. Before we go over the key terms on this slide, know that there are 2 different definitions for meat. So the very first definition is a very basic definition. This is animal flesh, and this applies to any animal. The second definition, and the one that we used in the chapter that discussed meat, is animal flesh from mammals. So we may use meat in this chapter when we're talking about poultry and fish, but when we're talking about poultry and fish meat, we're talking about their flesh and not the fact that they are classified as meat. A little bit confusing, but it should make sense when we do go over it. So fish and birds are their own classifications of animals and do not fall under the mammal category, and that is how they are different from meat. Many of their cooking principles, food safety principles, are very similar. Understanding meat does provide a background for understanding how to cook poultry and fish, which will make the information for this chapter easier to grasp. But there are a few different foodborne illness risks with poultry and with fish, and there are a few additional cooking considerations that we need to recognize when working with poultry and fish in the kitchen. So poultry, they are birds. Specifically, they are birds that are raised for egg and meat, and they include animals like chicken, quail, turkey, ducks, geese, and many, many others. There are two main classifications of fish. Finfish are considered quote-unquote true fish. So finfish have fins, as you can see with the picture of the shark on the right, and they also have an internal skeletal structure. How do we know this? Because we cannot see their bones. Shellfish, they may appear more like sea animals than actual fish, but they're still classified as fish. They have bones, or their shell, which form an outer layer on the shellfish. So their bones, their skeletal structure is on the outside for shellfish, which is different than finfish, which have skeletons on the inside, which is pretty obvious just from looking at them. Connective tissue is the tissue that supports and binds organs and muscles. More connective tissue causes greater meat toughness. Remember that concept. Again, connective tissue binds muscles and organs, and it is found in higher quantities of muscular meats, and meats that are high in connective tissue or high in muscle are generally less tender. So tenderness, regardless of whether you're eating a meat that has large amounts of muscle or protein, tenderness is always going to be an optimal characteristic of meat, poultry, and seafood. So because we still are going to eat meats that have lots of muscle and lots of connective tissue, we have to figure out a way that's going to be effective at cooking them and creating tenderness in these meats. So to do so, what we are going to do generally in terms of just cooking is to cook these tough meats, the ones with greater connective tissue, for longer periods of time and generally at lower temperatures, because exposing these types of meats, exposing connective tissue to low temperatures for long periods of time is very effective at breaking down that connective tissue, which is going to make that meat much more tender. Poultry, there are two main types of poultry, which we'll go over shortly. Poultry has varying levels of connective tissue in different locations of their bodies. The areas that are more used or more muscular are going to have more connective tissue. The areas that are less used or less muscular will have less connective tissue. And generally with fish, they have very low connective tissue, and so when we cook fish, we're generally going to be cooking fish at high temperatures for a very short amount of time, because a short amount of cooking is what is appropriate for animals that have low connective tissue. Well, fish have low connective tissue all around. Poultry are more similar to animals in the sense that there are different areas of their bodies that are more exercised than others, and so you have a balance between meats from poultry that have a lot of muscle and a lot of connective tissue, which are much tougher meats, and meats that are less exercised, have less connective tissue, and therefore are tender right off the bat. So there's two main types of meat that we get from poultry. They can be broken down into white or light meat, which is the breast and the wings, or the dark meat, which is the legs. For the light meat, these are less exercised and therefore have less connective tissue and require a shorter cooking time. So light meat is more similar to fish and automatically, right off the bat, much more tender. Consider that chicken and turkey are not that great in flying. So they can get a little bit of air, they sort of jump but their wings don't really do much. So their wings are not very well developed and therefore do not have much muscle in them. The same is true for chicken breasts. Not used very frequently, and therefore it's going to be a softer structure with less connective tissue. Meanwhile, a darker meat indicates more muscle. Poultry legs are used quite frequently and therefore are very muscularly developed. They're going to have more connective tissue and therefore are less tender, so they need to be cooked at lower temperatures for longer periods of time to break down their connective tissue. When picking out fresh poultry and fish, the poultry and fish should look as close as possible to when they were last alive. This is relatively easy to determine with fish because when you buy fish, a lot of the times it is still completely intact, whereas the chicken, well, it's missing a few essential pieces that are going to tell you whether or not it looks alive. Post-death with any animal, there is going to be some decay that occurs, and therefore the characteristics on this slide indicate freshness, and they relate that to close to alive. So fish, they should have bright eyes, they should be shiny and clean. If they are packed in ice, the ice should not be dirty, as this indicates that the fish is not remaining intact and is losing freshness. There will almost always be some type of odor from the fish, but this smell should not be a fishy smell. It should still smell fresh. There may be some clear liquid on the outer skin of the fish. However, if the liquid on the outer layer of the fish is milky, then the fish is releasing certain chemicals that indicate that it is nearing spoilage. And for shellfish, their shells should not be easily pried open. This indicates if the shells are tough and intact. This indicates that the tendons have not had time to decay and still have some strength, which is a good thing for shellfish. For poultry, if the poultry has a more vibrant color, such as a creamy white or a deep yellow, it is safe to eat. A duller color, such as pasty white or gray, indicates that it will not be as fresh. Also, be mindful of the odor. If the smell is not fresh, the poultry is not fresh. One consideration worth mentioning related to the smell of poultry is that oxidation or exposure to oxygen that occurs when a poultry package is open may cause an initial off odor. If you do smell this, wait a few minutes after opening the package and smell again. If the smell has gone away, it is safe to eat and it is just from mild oxidation, which is okay. If the odor is still off, it will not be fresh and it may be spoiled. Well, we've already gone over these concepts a few times. We're going to be talking about a few different cooking techniques in a few slides in very great detail. And these cooking techniques are a little bit more specific than moist or dry heat. But to really get a good understanding of what each of those are, it's important that we go over moist heat and dry heat one more time just to have the ideas of these types of cooking fresh in our minds so that we understand why we're cooking certain cuts of meat in certain conditions and in certain temperatures. So moist heat, this is cooking with water in some form, and we say in some form because it could be simply throwing food into a pot of boiling water, or we could boil water and let the steam from that water come up and cook the foods with that steam. So it does not actually have to be in liquid form. It can be in gas form or steam that's going to cook the foods. So a few examples of moist heat cooking are boiling, stewing, steaming, and blanching. When we're cooking with moist heat methods, we generally are cooking for longer periods of time at lower temperatures. And when we're cooking with meats or any type of animal products, we use moist heat cooking techniques for meats that have high amounts of muscle and connective tissue. Dry heat cooking involves cooking without water in any way, shape, or form. So we can heat through fat, such as an oil or a solid like butter, or through air currents when we're baking, when we're surrounding a food with rays of heat, but it's not actually in contact with the heating surface. When we're using a fat, dry heat cooking techniques include sautéing and frying, and then other dry heat cooking techniques that involve sending heat to food through air currents are roasting, baking, and grilling. So dry heat cooking is generally at higher temperatures for shorter amounts of time, and it's used for meats with low amounts of connective tissue. So far in this class, we've only talked about dry heat and moist heat cooking. Now we're going to be getting a few specific examples. And while there are many others, these cooking techniques are the ones that are most commonly used for different types of meats, and then fish and poultry. So roasting and baking is a form of dry heat in which hot air surrounds the food and cooks the food evenly on all sides. There is also going to be some heating that's going to occur on the entire surface of the meat, and this is going to cause browning, which is going to add some flavor. This method of cooking is ideal for large, whole meats. Broiling involves cooking at a high heat for a short period of time. Think about what types of meats would be ideal for this method of cooking. The high heat causes a shorter cooking time, but the insides of large meats require time to be heated. So this method of cooking would be more optimal for thinner meats. For sautéing, you cook the food in a pan with a small amount of fat at a relatively high heat. With sautéing, it's essential to keep food moving to prevent overcooking of one area, and this is going to be ideal for smaller chunks or pieces of meat. Deep fat frying involves submerging meat in heated oil or fat, and this allows a great deal of fat to be incorporated into a food, which will greatly increase the meat's tenderness. However, consider oxidation by heat. Oxidation by heat occurs when fats or oils are exposed to excessive heat, which causes rancidity or breakdown of the fats. And when we eat these fats, this is related to inflammation and the development of associated chronic diseases. Of course, for any of the cooking methods that use fat, there are certain temperatures that fats can be cooked at or below that will prevent oxidation from occurring, but many times they are heated over this point, and then the fat is broken down, and then when we eat these fats, we're more likely to develop complications. For moist heat, pressure cooking is a very unique form of heating a food. We do two things with pressure cooking. We cook the food and liquid, and then we also apply a great deal of pressure. So we're using pressure and heat to cook the food. This allows tougher cuts of meat to be cooked at a very quick rate, because this breaks down the collagen in these tougher cuts very quickly. Stewing is a long, slow cooking period, typically in broth and the juice of certain meats and vegetables that are being cooked. Because we're cooking these meats and vegetables at very low temperatures for long periods of time, stewing is very effective at breaking down the collagen of very tough meats. Also, stewing with a mixture of other vegetables allows a variety of flavors to be incorporated into the stewed foods, because the meats, the sauce, the vegetables are all leaching out their flavors into the rest of the dish. So they may be losing some of their flavor from within that specific food, but that flavor is not being lost from the dish and it's going into other types of foods. Braising is very similar to stewing. However, before we let the foods sit in their juices for a long period of time, the meats are seared or heated to very high temperatures initially to create browning on the outer layer of the meats. And this browning, like we talked about with roasting and baking, is going to add additional flavor to the meat. The bottom line is, for all of these, notice that dry heat generally involves higher temperatures for shorter periods of time, while moist heat involves longer cooking times at lower temperatures for tougher cuts of meat. The previous slide outlines a number of different cooking techniques that can be used in a variety of different situations that will create different outcomes. However, it's most important that you have a general idea of which general cooking methods are most appropriate for fish and then the two different classifications of poultry. So for dark poultry, this always is going to indicate a lot of muscle and perhaps more connective tissue, and as a result, we're going to be using moist heat at lower temperatures. White poultry and fish have very low amounts of muscle and connective tissue, and as a result, we use dry heat and do this for shorter periods of time. Now, dry heat can be heated to higher temperatures than moist heat. For 2 points of extra credit, please send me an email letting me know why this is. Why can moist heat be heated to lower temperatures than dry heat? Or a better way to word that would be, why can dry heat be heated to higher temperatures than moist heat? So please email this to me by Friday at midnight for 2 points of extra credit that will be applied to your most recent exam. The nutritional value of poultry is very similar to that of fish, and the nutritional value of both of these foods is very similar to protein that's found in mammals or in our definition of meat. All of these foods have protein, and it's found in all of these foods and all animal products in very high quantities. The amount in poultry and fish is actually very similar to the amount of protein found in mammal meats. Protein is responsible for building and maintaining muscle and also building and maintaining bone. Protein contains enzymes which allow chemical reactions to occur in the body, and technically protein is a source of energy, but it is not as effective at providing the body with energy, and if we do have to use protein for energy, we're generally breaking down very essential muscle tissue, which is not good. Poultry is a great source of tryptophan. This has two major functions in our body. This helps us to fall asleep when it is time for us to go to sleep. And tryptophan also helps to create serotonin, which is a feel-good hormone, which makes us feel good. Fish and poultry both have bone-strengthening nutrients. In addition to protein, they include vitamin D, phosphorus, and magnesium, which either aid in the structure or help with the metabolism of nutrients that will lead to optimal bone structure. The B vitamin and iron that are found in fish and poultry are energy-boosting nutrients, and these play a major role in energy metabolism and overall greater vitality. Omega-3 fatty acids are found in very high quantities in a variety of foods, including things like beans, nuts, seeds, and other types of meat. However, they're very high in fish, and so that's why we're talking about omega-3s when we're talking about fish in this chapter. The problem that we have with omega-3s in the United States is that we generally eat too few of these in combination with eating too many omega-6 fatty acids. And it's very important that we get a good balance between those two in order to negate the effects of a very high omega-6 fatty acid intake. So a high omega-6 fatty acid intake is related to inflammation. And as we've discussed many times in previous chapters, inflammation is the root cause for a variety of different chronic diseases, such as heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and many, many, many more. So omega-3s are so important because they are the building blocks and key chemicals that are responsible for creating hormones that are going to promote immune function, appropriate blood clotting, cell growth, and inflammation reduction. So if we reduce inflammation, that means that if there's any plaque buildup that's occurring in our arteries, we can get rid of that, and we can also prevent the risk for chronic disease that may have been increased through dietary and lifestyle practices that have caused inflammation to occur within our bodies. Listeria and Salmonella are two different microorganisms but contaminate food through similar processes, and both are associated with very serious complications. General food safety practices are incredibly effective at reducing foodborne illnesses if they are performed correctly. However, if ignored or if a mistake is made, microorganism contamination can occur. The next slide will revisit food safety practices that are designed to prevent these foodborne illnesses, but this slide will highlight what we are working against and the dangers associated with contamination from these bacteria. Now, it may sound gross, but both of these diseases, or the contamination of foods from these microorganisms, is related to shared feces in some way, shape, or form. Generally, this is from not washing hands after using the bathroom. The symptoms of salmonella contamination are related to intestinal tract complications, and they include nausea, vomiting, and severe cramping. For Listeria, a person can become contaminated or become infected with Listeria by eating a contaminated food, and generally they're not going to experience very severe symptoms. However, if a person does have a compromised immune system, they will become susceptible to a blood infection or inflammation of their internal cell membranes. It gets very serious when a pregnant woman is sick with Listeria, because Listeria can affect the unborn baby, and many times this results in a very premature birth and even death of the baby. And this can all occur even if the mother is only mildly affected with Listeria. Prevention strategies for foodborne illnesses that come from poultry and from seafood are very similar to practices that are used for meat. Wash your hands very thoroughly after using the bathroom or after touching any other surfaces or grasping any other handles that are in the kitchen, because any of these surfaces, unless you have personally cleaned them or seen them clean, could be contaminated and could be loaded with bacteria that would be transferred to the food. Always separate raw meats from ready-to-eat foods, because raw meats, through simply touching ready-to-eat foods, can transfer microorganisms which can contaminate those foods, even if those foods are not generally susceptible to that type of microorganism contamination. Heating the foods is very important, especially for fish and for poultry. Poultry is very, very susceptible to microorganism contamination from Salmonella, and as a result, the recommended cooking temperature for poultry is 165 degrees. For fish, this is a little bit lower, but it is still important that this internal temperature is reached. For fish, it is 145 degrees. And for both of these temperatures, it's essential that this temperature is taken at the very center of the meat. For refrigeration of each of these foods, it's also very important that these guidelines are taken into consideration. For fish, if it is fresh, uncooked fish, it should be refrigerated for no more than 1 to 2 days. If it's going to be longer than that, it should be frozen and then thawed when it is ready to cook. And then once fish is cooked, it can stay in the refrigerator for 3 to 4 days. For poultry, it's the exact same guideline. If it's fresh and uncooked, it can stay in the refrigerator for 1 to 2 days, and if it is cooked, it can stay in the refrigerator for 2 to 4 days. Now, for different types of shellfish, there are different recommendations for how they should be cooked. For shrimp, lobster, and crabs, it's important that these are cooked until the flesh is pearly and opaque. For clams, oysters, and mussels, cook them until the shells open during the cooking, and then for scallops, cook until the flesh is milky white or opaque and firm. That's all for this chapter. Again, if you did do any of the extra credit for next week, your Exam 3 grade will be updated. And if you are missing any assignments or any grades for quizzes or anything related to your grades that you are not certain about, please send me a message as soon as possible so that we can get that squared away and at least make sure that we are able to give you some points for those assignments and exams or quizzes. Thank you all very much for listening and have a great week.